meters across, so you'll be able to actually look inside the DNA helix. That, I think, is quite remarkable. Certainly, there may be improvements in quantum computing and interplanetary signaling, and just possibly, if we do have man-made global warming, we might have a solution to carbon emissions with nuclear fusion. This is Livermore, and in this amazing chamber, which is 5 meters high, surrounded by 2 feet of concrete, and outside it another 10 foot of concrete, is this empty chamber into which are pointed 192 of the most powerful lasers in the world. And they are all focused on this capsule, which is gold, and in the center of this capsule are 2 pellets of deuterium oxide, 2 millimeters across. And when all these lasers are focused exactly in the same spot from all different directions in this chamber, at the end of this thing that's going in the center, at the moment the lasers are switched on, more power is delivered to those pellets of deuterium than the entire power produced by the complete United States national grid. And at that moment, of course, those pellets are compressed. And when they're compressed, the protons fuse, more energy is generated, neutrons are released, and of course you can then use possibly those neutrons to drive a steam turbine or whatever. That's yet to be shown and proved. But the person who heads that facility is Ed Moses, an amazing man. You think of him, when you meet him, you think he's a bit of a cowboy, but he's an extraordinarily interesting chap to talk to. And one of the things I asked him was, well, if you're going to save the planet, that's fantastic, but how was it you managed to get George W. Bush, a notable skeptic, to pay $160 million a year to maintain your facility? And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, it's of course because it's of our nuclear weapons program. The downside to technology is not always obvious, but it is, I think, always there. So let me leave you with 7 aphorisms that I think may be valuable about science. The first is that the announcements of most discoveries are heralded by exaggerated claims. The next is that nearly all technological advances have threatening aspects which are unrecognized at the time of invention. That most discoveries have beneficial applications that we don't recognize at the time, the laser being an amazing example of that, and that even democratic governments misuse scientific knowledge. And I didn't explore that argument with you, but if you take genetics, for example, after the Nazi Holocaust, more people in Sweden were sterilized without consent because they were thought to be unfit to bear children genetically than before the Second World War. In California, 40,000 women were sterilized. And in Britain, we also had a eugenic policy immediately after the war, certainly in how we handled babies. So even democratic governments are capable of using science for their own purposes. I think it's also true we reinvent the same technological advances all the time. If I'm very honest, and I look back at my own publications, sort of 300, I think, in peer-reviewed journals, I don't think there's anything there that's utterly original. We depend on other people's work all the time. And when I look back, I can see again and again that I did things which I thought were new at the time, but when I looked in the Russian literature, they'd been done 30 years earlier. Scientists, like every other human, are not objective. And lastly, something that's just worth bearing in mind, we can't actually predict the future. Let me leave you with Joseph Rice of Derby and his painting at the time of, or just after Priestley. And there he's got this bird in this glass vial which is being depleted of oxygen, and the 2 little girls there, obviously members of the family, can't even bear to watch the bird suffering. The chap on the right-hand side is looking deeply, intently, obviously probably not approving the experiment. On the left-hand side, we have a couple who are clearly courting, much more interested in sex than the bird. And the scientist is particularly interesting, because the scientist, if he represents Priestley or not, but the scientist is not engaging. He's not actually interested in what's happening humanly around him. He's got this extraordinary expression looking away into the future. Let us make no mistake, that if we are ready to have our technology accepted and acceptable, we need to consider its implications, we need to examine the ethics of what we're doing, and we need to make sure that we communicate and listen to the people who it will most affect. That, of course, is the general public. Thank you very much for listening to me.